Hello and welcome to a revision session. In particular, we're looking at the impact of war on Britain unit, and we're going to be thinking about the government powers that existed during wartime in World War I and World War II. So let's start by looking at World War I and in particular at Dora. So Dora was the Defence of the Realm Act. That's what Dora stands for. It was introduced in 1914 at the beginning of World War I. It was passed to give the government special powers to make sure that the country could fight the war and keep people safe when they were at home. It allowed the government to censor newspapers. That means they could control what was being published. It also restricted what people could do. Among many other things, they were not allowed to talk about military affairs in public, like bonfires or fireworks, by binoculars or ring church bells. So why do you think they weren't allowed to do these things? Well, if they're talking about military affairs in public, that might mean that the enemy, if there were spies around, might hear about those military affairs, and that might give things away to the enemy. Lighting bonfires or fireworks. At night, they were meant to have a blackout because of Zeppelin raids, and then later on also the Gotha bomber raids during World War I. So they didn't want to draw attention to any areas where people might be living. Buying binoculars. The reason that they would have controlled the buying and selling of binoculars would be, obviously those could be used to spot enemy aircraft, which is great if you're in a role where you're meant to do that, but it also might be used to spy. Ringing church bells, similar reason to the bonfires and fireworks. You don't necessarily want to draw attention to areas where there are people living. As the war went on, the government brought in other measures. These included British summertime, putting the clocks an hour forwards in the summer to create more daylight hours, controlling the consumption of alcohol so that people did not miss work as a result of having a hangover. Pub opening hours were reduced and beer was watered down, and people were forbidden to buy rounds of drinks. So all of these things were trying to reduce any problems that might occur as a result of people having too much alcohol. Strikes in essential industries were forbidden. That means that then work in industrial factories and creating munitions and things like that would never stop. People in reserve occupations like farming and mining were not allowed to join the army, and that meant that they could make sure that farms were producing enough food for the country and that mines were continuing to get the important sort of ores from the ground that would be used in munitions and metalwork. Conscription also happened in the First World War. At the start of the war, men were persuaded to join the army through use of posters and peer pressure. But as the war went on, the numbers of men volunteering fell because they heard more about the high number of casualties, a high number of people dying on the front line, especially after the Battle of the Somme. And they obviously saw less people coming home, and they heard about shell shock and other problems that occurred on the front line. As a result, the government realised by 1916 that they needed to introduce conscription. So they tried PALS battalions where people joined up with their friends already. They tried other methods of lots of propaganda trying to get people to join up. But ultimately by 1916 they turned to conscription, which is forcing men between 18 and 41 to join the army if they were unmarried. In May this was extended to married men as well. A total of 3.5 million men were conscripted to go and fight, so it was relatively successful. As originally Lord Kitchener had only wanted about 100,000 men, and they managed to get a lot more volunteering than that initially, but 3.5 million were conscripted as well. The only exceptions to conscription were if a man was in a reserve occupation like we've mentioned, so mining or farming, men were ill, or men had family responsibilities which meant that they weren't able to go and fight. So for example, they're looking after an elderly parent who couldn't look after themselves, or perhaps if they were a single father. There were some people called conscientious objectors who chose on their conscience, so they didn't believe in fighting because they either religious reasons or it could be personal reasons that they didn't believe in fighting. And there were other groups of people as well who some called cowards, people who were scared of going to fight on the front lines. Conscientious objectors and cowards could be sent to prison for long periods of time for refusing to join the army when they were requested to. So those were some of the powers that the government had during World War I. Well, we've briefly mentioned that the government had powers of propaganda and censorship to try and ensure that the war ran smoothly. So censorship from the start of both wars, but in particular in World War One, all newspapers were censored. That meant all bad news was withheld. So you weren't allowed to report on casualties, for example, in the papers, or on losses in battles. Journalists were allowed at the front from 1916, but they were only allowed to publish good news. So good news stories about soldiers or about successes in battle. So you might expect to see different stories from people who were on the front line, the soldiers themselves, and those in the newspapers. Newspaper articles also had to be checked to make sure that no information could be used for the enemy. So there would be a lack of detail about perhaps where people were, or what exactly was happening, or what plans there were for what happened next, because they didn't want to give anything away to the enemy. Letters to loved ones were also censored. So all letters sent home from the front, where the soldiers were also censored, so that people at home didn't know where their loved ones were fighting or what conditions at the front were like, for two different reasons. They don't want them to know where they're fighting, because that might give information to the enemy if they read it, and they don't want them to know, the government doesn't want them to know what conditions at the front were like, because they still want people to sign up to join the army, and also because they don't want people's morale at home to be low. In World War One, propaganda posters encouraged men to join the army. One of the key things that propaganda, things that are trying to make you think or do something, the main cause for propaganda posters was to try and get people to enlist in the army. So there's all sorts of different ways that they did that. Some tried to sort of show how awful the enemy was. So we've got destroy this mad brute, enlist. We've got sort of a guerrilla here seizing a woman, and it's trying to say, you know, these people are really evil and we've got to destroy them. And we've got ones that says, come lad, slip across and help. It's trying to make it look like it's going to be really easy. Them shaking hands suggests some sort of friendship. There were lots of posters telling people to sort of join with their mates, that it was going to be fun, that it would be over by Christmas. There were ones trying to make it look like you're defending your children or your wife. There's posters showing women trying to encourage the men to enlist. Women, the women say go, encouraging them to sort of say that it was the right thing to do. One story told of a factory in Germany where the bodies of prisoners of war were melted down and used to make candles and boot polish. Obviously this was completely made up, but people at the time believed it. Anti-German hatred became so acute that families with German names were attacked. The royal family actually changed their surname from Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, which was a German surname, to Windsor as well. So propaganda was anti-German and also pro getting people to enlist. So what about in World War II? Well, the key law that was passed giving the government extra powers in World War II was the Emergency Powers Act. This was passed in May 1940, so just sort of a year into the Second World War. So May 1940, when France was on the verge of surrendering to the Germans, it seemed very likely that Britain might be invaded and possibly even conquered by the Germans if they didn't take severe action. So May 1940, we see the government wanting much tighter controls and restrictions than they had done previously in World War II, as the threat level was higher. The Emergency Powers Act gave the government almost unlimited powers. Civilians could be required to do absolutely anything that the government wished, and they could be sent anywhere in the country. And the reason for these almost unlimited powers, very different from those seen in World War One, much more open really, people could be asked to do anything by the government, was exactly for the reason that we've just discussed. That in May 1940, France was pretty much surrendering to Germany, and they believed that Britain was going to be invaded and potentially conquered by the Germans as well. So this obviously also seeps into propaganda and censorship. So propaganda and censorship in World War II. In World War II, propaganda posters were used to persuade people that they could win the war and persuade people to do things that would keep the country running and keep them safe. Because conscription was used from the beginning of World War II, less posters would be about conscription and they're more about morale and the war effort in general. So, for example, we can see a poster here. When you ride alone, you ride with Hitler. Join a car-sharing club today. So this is more about encouraging people to do the right thing for the country. If they were sharing cars, obviously they're not really sharing them with Hitler, but what they're saying is you're helping the enemy, you're helping Hitler, and you can see a sort of a ghost image of Hitler there alongside this person in an empty car. And one of the problems they had in World War II was coal had to start to be rationed because they ran out of it. They were running out of it. So as a result of that, they're trying to say, save coal. There could be 3 or 4 extra people in this car. Rather than wasting it, wasting fuel and things like that, you could be sharing your car. So they're using propaganda to try and persuade people to do things to keep the country running. So in World War II, the government used posters to encourage people to be careful who they spoke to. Loose lips lose lives and things like that. Although Britain does not normally censor information, people accepted it in wartime. They weren't really against it because they believed it was necessary to help the safety of the country, and they understood why the government was doing it. So there wasn't really much resistance to the government having that power of censorship. In World War II, newspapers told mainly positive stories, just like in World War I. For example, events at the Battle of Dunkirk, which was a huge failure for the British. It was a sort of sea invasion on France, and they go into Dunkirk, and almost all the people are slaughtered on the beaches, and lots of people have to send out boats to try and get as many troops back as possible. It's a huge failure for the British. But the Battle of Dunkirk was reported in British papers almost as if it was a victory, telling them stories mainly of those who were saving the men from the beaches, lifting them from the beaches, and how they'd been really heroic in saving them. And they didn't record that as many had been captured along with equipment that they'd taken with them. So the newspapers only tell the stories of those saving those on the beaches, and they completely miss out the fact that lots of people have been killed, injured, and taken enemy and hostage by the Germans. Film was another method of propaganda. Films were made during the wars to keep morale up and to keep the country informed about the war. So in World War I, the most famous film was the Battle of the Somme. It showed real film footage from the front, and it gave it was really popular as it gave people the first opportunity to see what conditions were actually like on the front line. So in World War II, newsreels were played mainly before main films. So every film that someone went to see, they would see a newsreel film about the war effort. Stories were upbeat, showing victories in battles, and people across the country pulling together to win the war and survive the bombing. So it was all about keeping morale high and keeping people feeling that they're a part of something bigger, and that they're working together as a country. Fictional films were also made showing heroic deeds by British people. So there's one example called In Which We Serve, where lots of men were shown doing those jobs, and you've got women being nurses on the front lines and things like that as well. The radio was also a key method of propaganda during World War II. News bulletins sharing good news and sort of positive stories on there were listened to across the country, and generally told the truth, although they were also subject to censorship, and some stories weren't allowed on the radio. So, for example, the movements of Winston Churchill and the weather forecast weren't ever broadcast on the radio or in newspapers because Winston Churchill was a prime minister. They don't want the enemy to know where the prime minister is in case he's attacked, and the weather forecast might be helpful to the enemy if they were trying to work out was it safe to fly in Britain and that sort of thing. So they didn't want to help them in any way. The radio was also a major form of entertainment. Entertainment was encouraged because if people were entertained, they were happier, morale would stay higher, they'd be more likely to continue with the war effort. In, 1941, there were 21 dance programmes a week on the radio, where people could listen to dance music and dance around at home. Comedy programmes helped keep morale of the country high, and there were programmes like ITMA, It's That Man Again, featured Tommy Handley, a famous comedian. He attracted large audiences each week. Music While You Work was a programme played through the afternoons to keep workers in factories happy and the production high. So you might read sources of people sort of singing along together and that sort of thing in factories. If it's reported in a newspaper, the reason for that will be because they're trying to share good news stories. Perhaps something else has happened they're trying to divert attention from. Especially if it's around the sort of 40, 41 when we've had the Blitz. They're trying to keep people's morale high despite the circumstances that they're facing. People might generally have been happy in some cases. Entertainment, the government realised both conflicts in both World War I and World War II, that entertainment would play a significant role in maintaining morale. In World War II, the government encouraged entertainment through organisations like the ENSA, the Entertainment's National Service Association, which provided not only entertainment for the armed forces, so it would send out bands and groups of singers, often women like Vera Lynn, to go and sing to the troops and make them feel that happy and valued by the British people, but also for civilians as well, people at work and families sheltering from the Blitz in the London Underground. So the Entertainment's National Service Association might send groups of people to play music or to make people feel entertained or happier or safer in those very difficult periods. So that's the end of this very short revision video looking at the impact of war on Britain, in particular government powers during World War I and World War II. Good luck with your revision.